Next half of this breakout with another mental health related session. This session is presenting the session to Michelle Spearing. And Michelle is a neurodivergent licensed therapist and instructional designer. She's the co-founder and director of clinical innovation and integration at Create Space Health, an organization that provides support programs, courses, mental health tools, and training to organizations.
Awesome, thank you for that intro. And my co-founder Courtney is back there. She's here supporting this as well. So if you have any other questions afterwards, that she's another friendly face. So part of my neurodivergence is that I got my slides in late. So I have a couple options for you all who might want a little more visual and a little more interaction. So I'm going to pass these two around and grab one if you feel like that benefits you, especially the part where you can fill in your own as we go. But if you feel like you are okay waiting until afterwards, everybody will have access to the handouts and the presentation eventually. So I will just pass that around here. So as I'm doing that, just to get a feel for the room, is anybody aware of what affirming care is? Raise your hand, like if you know what it is. Affirming care. Cool. So it's definitely a newer term out there. So it's not surprising that there's only a couple of hands in the air. So when I wanted to start building this presentation, I did what my brain often does, which is go to the literal definition. So I looked up the definition of affirm, and affirm is a verb. And so that means it's an action. And there's actually two very different definitions. One is to assert facts strongly, and one is to emotionally encourage. So very different definitions of this word, but there can be a crossover. And that is what affirming care is about. And so one of the things that I really like about talking about affirming care related to neurodivergence is that it's something that's not just a tool for us. It's affirming care for and fill in the blank population. It could be for seniors, it could be for children, it could be for mental health issues, it could be for substance issues. And since we are a group and a population that often experiences co-occurring disorders, I really like how it can apply across the board. But it can also be helpful to know, specifically what is this in terms of neurodivergence, how can it be helpful, and what are some strategies that apply to specifically us as a neurodivergent population. So part of defining affirming care for yourself is going to be personal. So is there a way to turn off this part so I can raise my hand? So I realized that because I don't have my slides up here, that I didn't give you guys a little intro into who I am too. So that might be helpful to know, other than just that we have a practice called Create Space Health. So my name is Michelle. I'm neurodivergent. I have a very diverse range of neurodivergence in my household. And I'm a mom to two neurodivergent kiddos. And my dad lives with me, who's also neurodivergent and undiagnosed, and I'm kind of a caregiver in that role with him. So a lot of experience on that front, but then I'm also an LPCC in Minnesota and an art therapist. And a lot of what you were saying resonated. A lot of the tools that correlate with mental health and neurodivergent is regulation. So that's kind of my jam, is mindfulness and polyvagal regulation, just learning to understand our own minds and bodies so that we can advocate for ourselves and really connect with things like affirming care, even just as a concept to understand ourselves, but then also how do we find resources that are actively using that as a methodology or a model. So as far as defining yourself, so one of the things in my ADHD journey that I learned was helpful and my brain that needs things to make sense was to redefine ADHD in a way that it made sense to me. So For me, ADHD is accepting dysregulation. So this one is 2 words, depending on the day, which is classic of dysregulation, right? So happily and or heavily daily. So the whole attention, the whole hyperactive, the whole meaning behind those words didn't ever feel like they fit to me, but this felt like it fit me. And so that's what I hope that you guys can start to take away from today, is thinking of this affirm word as something you can define for yourself, and let that empower you to decide, you know, how you want to apply it to your own care and your own life. So let me pull this up quick. I might be an acronym person, but affirm, this will be on the handouts that I send you to, but I did come up with some words that I feel like encompass the principles of affirming care. There are a lot of models emerging. It often came, it started emerging in the medical field and healthcare field in terms of LGBTQ affirming care. So as we know, like a lot of that can relate to just language choices and options, but overall, it's just accepting that you are the expert of your own life and that matters. And so that applies to any group that affirming care is applied to, but I think it is especially impactful with neurodivergent populations because of all of our experiences and everything we've been talking about today, trauma leads us to feel like that sometimes it leads to lower self-worth, sometimes it leads to chronic self-doubt, sometimes it's literally the pattern of other people telling us that experience doesn't make sense, that feeling doesn't make sense, you don't fit in this box. And it's basically because we don't. We are a round peg trying to shove ourselves into a square. So that is where affirming care approach comes in, is saying, no, I affirm that I am a round peg and I affirm that this is my experience. And some of that is doing the work of figuring out what our needs are. And so we're going to go over some strategies today after we kind of review some of the principles so we just get more of a foundation. But then the key is going to be, you know, applying those strategies to you as an individual. So it might be that your brain is like mine and you like the idea of defining affirm on your own. And you take some of this information and you define that for yourself, and it just can stick in your brain easier that way. Or it might be that, you know, you take the handout or make your own lists that help you think through these things and how you want to apply them to the different spaces in your life. So let me look at, I just want to read off, because I know I'm sorry that you guys don't have the visual right now, but I just want to read off the principles of affirming care that apply across the board so that we can start to think about kind of how to put the lens of neurodivergence on that. So number 1 is respect and dignity. Number 2 is diversity and inclusion. Number 3 is equity empowered. Number 4 is listening and learning. Number 5 is awareness and accessibility. So that kind of merges a couple of the affirming care models that are out there in the healthcare field right now and the principles that guide them. So a couple different approaches will apply depending on the space you're using this for. You know, that you can apply affirming care to your home. You can apply affirming care to your therapist or your mental health provider that you pick. You could apply affirming care to the doctor or the provider that you choose. And it's up to you if you want to choose new, start anew, get a fresh start with a new provider and apply it in that way, or if you want to just think about ways that you can make adjustments that are going to fit for you that can integrate affirming care into how you connect with these resources that aren't always designed for us. So helping them fit better for us. And I think that one way to do that is to think through the lens of this care model. And that goes along the lines with the strategies that we'll look at in each area. So one thing I want to pull up here. So in the way that I made this acronym, I also looked at care through that lens. So C being compassion, A being authentic, R being regulate, and E being empathy with equity. And if you've gotten the handout, you can see that listed for each space of applying that affirming care to as well. And these aren't easy things to do. So that's why we're kind of trying to break it down to think, affirming care isn't just this terminology. It's something, it's the actual definition of affirm, where we want to focus on the actions. And so applying some of these words can help us think about what are small ways that we can integrate that into, the resources that we are creating for ourselves for support. So one of the areas on the handout is looking at affirming care at home. And I think this is a really great place to start because it's owning kind of how much of this relates to just our own choices and thinking through, okay, what's not working here? What's often triggering me? What's often bringing up a negative experience at home? What's causing conflict? What's preventing me from reaching the outcomes or the goals that I have? And then applying steps to change that. So one step before this step would be to make a list of things at home or in whatever space you're wanting to apply this. What are my stressors? What are the things that aren't working the way that I want or need them to work? And then make a separate list that says, what are possible solutions? What are possible solutions to X, Y, Z? So if I was to think about an example, it would be my daughter having a meltdown before school, that the right socks weren't available, or that this sock that was the right sock yesterday isn't the right sock today because of the differing feelings that we're having. And so what could a possible, I might put sock meltdowns in the stressor category. And then in the solution category, we could brainstorm together. It could be that, could we try a different way of picking out socks? Could we get rid of the other socks that you already know never work? Could you just feel more supported in a different way from your parents or your sister so that the sock feels more like something we can handle? So, kind of gives you a chance to brainstorm those things. And then after that, after those two lists, the bridge, creating the third list or the third image or the third just word that says, okay, how do I go from the problem to the solution with this bridge? So with the sock example, it ended up being more time. We need to just feel less pressured about finding the right sock immediately to get out the door. So let's adjust our approach and add time as the bridge. And so that's just one small example about an affirming approach at home. And this handout goes into breaking that down into the different areas of care and thinking about that at home. But it all starts with that list of what are the stressors, what are the solutions, and then how can I kind of fit it into this care bridge. As far as the strategies at work or strategies in the community, like going to get a therapist or going to work with a doctor, it still is a lot about the care elements. The compassion is the key. So whether it is that, your doctor is not fully getting like what your sensory experience is at the clinic, or that, maybe they're not fully seeing or hearing like the anxiety that it causes you to get to the clinic. So then we've talked a little bit about this morning, though, that I'm tired of advocating for myself. It's exhausting to start over. It's exhausting to have to advocate for this affirming care. So compassion is the key part of affirming care, because just like we're looking at our stressors and our limitations at home in that example, and the possible solutions, or you could say strengths, we have to apply that to other lenses. And I know that takes energy, but the thing that helps with that is compassion. So thinking about what could I provide to myself that's going to help my compassion to just be aware of what my needs are. So thinking about that home lens with those lists, now thinking about the doctor with that list. Okay, what are the stressors? What are the things? What am I not doing? Am I not, am I avoiding measuring my blood sugar even though I know I should? Am I, really anxious every time I go to the doctor, so my blood pressure is really high? And then I just kind of avoid that because I'm tired, So in giving yourself a little space to think through that lens of like curiosity and compassion, so that you can think about what are my needs actually in this space, in this setting, and from this care provider, and what am I not getting out of those needs? So basically what's the problem? And then brainstorming with some space, which sometimes we all need, any human of any range of needs, but especially related to neurodivergence and how much it impacts our brain and our processing time, that we give ourselves some space to then brainstorm some solutions that could feel good to us. And then think through the lens of compassion for the provider or for the system. And this is where it comes in that like the only approach to affirming care isn't just finding a care provider that's certified in affirming care, right? Because it's unfortunately not as available as we would like. It wouldn't meet all the needs, So this is kind of applying the lens of what they were talking about in the breakout group too, that, putting the ego aside a little bit, but that's a lot easier to do when we're going through the lens of compassion and thinking about our own needs and recognizing them as valid, and then brainstorming our own solutions, and then thinking about, okay, how could I advocate for this in whatever the setting is? Could I send an email? Could I ask a friend to go to the appointment with me to communicate this? Could I go in and talk to the front desk person because I really connected with them and trust them? Thinking about what those little simple solutions are to applying these issues and these solutions one step at a time. That's the other part. Like this list might be really long once you go into it, right? But giving yourself compassion and time to say, I'm going to be able to do this one thing at a time. I can't change the world overnight. I can't address every issue overnight, but I can do one thing at a time. And that can really help with this approach too, in not getting too overwhelmed and burnt out and tired and exhausted by the idea of having to advocate once again, Then the other part of compassion that I wanted to come back to is compassion for the provider. That if we have picked a provider that we feel like we connect with, we feel like we trust, we feel like we can relate to on some level, hopefully we're also feeling that level of acceptance with them that comes with that. That's the key of the affirming model. If we aren't, that might be a bigger problem to think about assessing and say, maybe I should consider changing providers. But if we are, then applying that same compassion to them, like asking the questions. Say, do you know much about neurodivergence? What do you know? What experience do you have? And asking more on that personal level if you ever get a chance, which I know appointments don't always allow for, but if you would, just have a moment to connect on that level, because then we're just talking person to person, and we're talking to a person who we feel pretty strongly at that point is on our team, and they want to be on our team, and they want to help us, and they want to help us make adjustments that are going to help with our outcomes and help us have a better experience in that space, but they might not know how. And so that's the key, is figuring out like, how can I advocate for myself? And it often comes through that lens of compassion, just having compassion for yourself and your limitations in those moments, and having compassion for them and their limitations and maybe lack of information or education or knowledge in that area. And then I'd say less less compassion for flawed systems, but at least an awareness of flawed systems. That even if you have an affirming care provider that you find who writes right on their bio on the website, I am an affirming care provider, it might not be that whole system is an affirming care system. It's very unlikely at this point. I don't know if it exists, but the key is then that, they were talking in the breakout group about that tolerance of discomfort. And I think that thinking through that lens of, I can tolerate discomfort when it serves a purpose. So bringing it back to that value and that purpose, and just being aware of what that is for you is what affirming care is all about, because you're not only affirming and supporting and encouraging your own emotions as valid, you're also asserting it as a fact, which is not something that we are often very comfortable with. But that's why simplifying it in some of these tools and using that compassion, leaning into that, is going to be the key. But basically, it's helpful to have the awareness and the context that we're working within a flawed system, and some level of radical acceptance around that, which isn't always easy based on the spoons that we have that day or the energy that we have that day. But when we kind of plan ahead and have this awareness of ourselves and our needs and what needs aren't being met, then we can, kind of attribute that layer of how the system impacts that whole picture. And it can actually build compassion for ourselves, be like, yeah, no wonder I feel like crap when I go to the doctor and this is what happens, but at the same time, not letting the sentence end there, saying, and I do deserve to have more support and more accessible strategies so that my health goals and my goals in my home of happiness, or my goals, at school or at work, my career goals, that could be a whole, that's the other thing, is that each one of these categories could be a whole 20-minute presentation, right? So I encourage you to spend time in each of the areas of your life to think through this in that context of that space. Home versus the medical doctor versus work and your career versus friendships. It can be applied across the spectrum to the different spaces. So, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that we've been told time and time again that our needs are different enough that they can't be met. And then we start to shove our needs down. So part of affirming care is taking the time and the space with compassion to assess what your needs are, assess what's not being met, and then figuring out the steps that you need to ask for what you need, and be able to say, you know what, no, my needs are valid, and this is how I can act on taking the steps to address that. So that is ultimately, I think, the goal of affirming care. And again, there are steps you can take to align with choices that are going to align more with an affirming approach. So at a workplace, it could be, looking at the culture, looking at their diversity, equity, inclusion departments and saying, okay, does this seem to integrate anything related to my experience and my needs? And if it doesn't, and you have a choice, then maybe exploring other careers or organizations or employers who maybe align better with those values. If it does, but it could use some tweaking, then maybe as you do your own brainstorming of your affirming approach and how you're going to strategize, you think about ways that you could use your energy and your voice to get involved and help with those improvements. So work is the DEI side, and then with providers like a therapist or a doctor, looking and researching providers beforehand, looking at their bios, looking for that verbiage on websites, affirming care, and it's basically going to align with the idea that they are going to be less about labels and more about listening. So I'm gonna listen first before I look at the label and say, okay, I already know what's happening, or okay, I already have the solution. You know, now they're gonna be taking an approach where you're the expert of your own life and experience. And so hopefully feeling a lot more acceptance and compassion and flexibility in the approaches with those providers. So looking for that verbiage, and when it's not there, asking the questions. Do you have any providers who do an affirming care approach? Or are any of your providers informed about this, or anybody that in your organization that I can talk to that would know, you know, affirming care is being addressed and you're working towards growth in that area? Because then, you know, at least like the system's just too slow to catch up yet, but there's people in there that can align with you and help you. So, yeah. Any questions?
Not so much a question as more, are you considering presenting in April?
I
have a question.
Oh,
so that it
she asked if I'm considering presenting in April. I was kind of seeing how this went first, seeing if they liked me or not. But I'm open to it. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you. Let me know if you have any other questions. You can always connect with our website or email me too. There's info on the handout. So www.createspacehealth.com.